Welcome back. We are now about to venture into learning a little bit more about cells. And a lot of this I'm going to go through fairly quickly. You're going to be using a gizmos too to take a look at these different structures and some of their functions. But for now, just stay tuned and we're going to go through the first group, which are the eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotes, EU means true, and karyo here means having to do with this kernel or nucleus that is where the DNA is contained in all cells, which are eukaryotic cells. So that includes plant and animal cells and probably most of the organisms that we're familiar with. All eukaryotic cells are surrounded or bordered by this plasma membrane. And a plasma membrane is made up of some of the materials we've talked about before, these things which are phospholipids. So if you remember that from the chapter before, we looked at the structure of something called a phospholipid, where it had a polar phosphate head and it had non-polar tails, which were facing inward. So this is called a bilayer because there's two layers of it. You can see the phosphate head right here, and then you can see the phosphate head above here. Inside, this is the interior of a cell, so we're seeing filaments, meaning just like thin threads, of something called the cytoskeleton. We're going to see what this is. It's somewhat of a supporting structure, but it has other roles too. Notice that there's another lipid here, and that's cholesterol. So cholesterol is embedded in the lipid areas of this phospholipid bilayer, and it maintains the cell membrane's sort of flexibility or rigidity depending on temperature. And a lot of the other stuff we're looking at, that all these crazy looking things, are proteins. Some proteins which are embedded in the membrane, in this phospholipid bilayer membrane, which are integral. So integrate or integral. There's also some which are just on the surface, might just be peripheral. So this is a peripheral membrane protein, meaning peripheral as far as the membrane is concerned. So it's just not all the way through. Some of these proteins actually serve as channels. So here's a channel. And then there are a few other things too. So here's a glycoprotein. So if you remember, we talked about the term glyco is referring to a sugar, and you know what a protein is. So this is a protein with some piece of a sugar attached, or carbohydrate. And then we have a glyco, again having to do with carbohydrate or sugars, lipid, which is also embedded here in this membrane. So the phospholipid bilayer is a really, really important structure. We're going to talk in more depth very soon. Some of these cells have little, what do we call, microvilli. And this in particular, these are cells of the small intestine. So you can see that what they've done here, they're kind of showing these kind of like up and down, these little microvilli, which serve to increase the amount of surface area for these cells in the small intestine in particular, so that they can absorb more of the nutrients that we eat. So that's just a specific example. Cytoplasm is an area, it's a region that exists between the plasma membrane and the nuclear membrane or nuclear envelope. And within that is this material we call cytosol. And that term I used before, cytoskeleton. So there's all this stuff that's kind of suspended in it. You might kind of think of cytosol as kind of like a gelatin almost. So, and then all this stuff is embedded or suspended in it. Most cytoplasm is water. So this is a large percentage of water. But it also has a little bit of semi-solid consistency, in part due to the proteins. Here's a picture of a nucleus. So this, don't be fooled, that whole thing we're looking at, but really this purple thing that kind of looks like it has an eyeball here. So here's the nucleus. Here's the DNA that you can see in the nucleus, kind of loosely threaded here. And within the nucleus is something called a nucleolus. This is involved with making RNA, and we'll talk about this later. And then outside the nucleus, the nucleus is surrounded by its own membrane, sometimes called the nuclear membrane or the nuclear envelope. And within that are pores, openings, because you need to have some openings that are going to allow things to move in, travel in or out of the nucleus. When I said that there's DNA in here, we can look at this DNA, and because it's kind of loosely threaded, it's not very organized. We call that chromatin. So that word chromatin is referring to this kind of not very organized form of the DNA. It's more the long threads. And then something that you'll hear more about later, this thing called the ER for short, just like emergency room, but what it really means is endoplasmic reticulum. And so this whole crazy looking thing outside that's called the endoplasmic reticulum. But this slide is really focused on the nucleus because it wants to show you that in most of the eukaryotic cells, it's really big as compared to, we're going to see that it's prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus, but the nucleus in truth is big by itself, as or even bigger than most of those other kinds of cells we call prokaryotic cells. The nuclear envelope, again, is like a membrane, and it's going to surround the nucleus. I'm not going to worry too much about the details in this, but it's just to know that it's the surrounding membrane around the nucleus. There's the nucleolus. We said that that's kind of like the eyeball within this whole eye. And it has to do with RNA and assembling proteins. Ribosomes, we've already learned a little bit about them. They're made up of something called RNA. In particular, they're made of something called rRNA, which is ribosomal RNA and proteins. We know that these have a role in making proteins, in the production of proteins, and they have a big role in that. So we find a lot of ribosomes in cells. They have two units. These are called subunits. There's a smaller one underneath and a bigger one on top. And this is where that information, the mRNA, the messenger RNA, that little copy of a piece of DNA, comes to ribosomes, and then the ribosomes assemble proteins. The mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. These little structures here make energy in a form that all cells use, which is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And this structure looks like a bean, and then when you look on the interior, what you see is there are membranes even within it. So there's membranes surrounding it, this outer membrane, but then there's these inner membranes that are all folded in here. And we'll talk about this in more detail later. Peroxisomes. You might think hydrogen peroxide, and here's the oxy piece of it, right? So peroxisomes are these little circular organelles that have a single membrane that surrounds them, and what they do is they detoxify poisons. So these are really important because a cell can be exposed to poisons. Also can just have things build up within the cell that needs to get broken down. So that's a peroxisome. There are areas there are some differences between animal and plant cells. And so this slide is really talking about what are some of those. And the one difference is that animal cells have something called MTOCs, which is a microtubule organizing center. And while both cells, both animal and plant, have that, animal cells also have something called centrioles. So you'll see these again. Again, this is just an introduction, a lot of new terms. You'll get more familiar with them as we talk about them. Animal cells have the centrosome, and they have something called lysosomes. Think Lysol, something that breaks stuff. In this case, lysosomes will break open bacteria, so they are sort of the immune piece of animal cells. They help protect it. Plant cells don't have that, so plant cells are more vulnerable. But plant cells do have some other things, including a wall, cell wall, and they have chloroplasts that make the structure that is filled with the green substance chlorophyll, and that's for making their own energy, or at least taking sunlight and making it into some form of simple sugar so that then it can be broken down for whatever energy needs it has. And it also has some other things in it, including the very large central vacuole. So I'll draw some of these out with you in class just to kind of walk through some of these structures. And like I said, you'll also do a gizmo that'll give you a little bit of a picture of this as well. So here's our animal cell. You can see it has all sorts of different structures within it that we're going to learn more about. And there is the plant cell. So you can see shape-wise they're somewhat different. This is more rectangular square. Here's the big central vacuole that's filled, it says, with cell sap. In other words, it's like a big reservoir of water and other dissolved materials inside a plant cell. It helps to keep the plant cell kind of rigid so that it has some structure, because remember, plants don't have real skeletons like animals do. So each of their cells need to have something that sort of maintains the cell structure. And there's the mitochondria, here's their little peroxisomes, here's a chloroplast. Here you can see all the stuff we just looked at with the plant or the animal cell. These are called centrosomes, and I'm going to talk about these when we look at how cells divide, how they make copies of themselves. But you can just kind of see what they look like here, that they're these cylinders that are all like put together. Kind of reminds me of a bunch of coffee stirrers that someone has formed into these little triplets. So there's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can see that then they all are put together to form this kind of a tube shape. Plant cell walls, we've already talked about this idea that there's a material called cellulose that forms the wall part around the cell. So the walls first, and then on the interior of that would be a cell membrane. And so this is a little different than prokaryotes, but we haven't discussed this yet, so I'm going to go on. Chloroplasts, we'll see these in detail later on, so just know that what they are, kind of what they look like. Central vacuole, we've already mentioned, and we're going to talk about what controls the condition on this of the cell. When this vacuole is either going to lose water or gain water. So we'll get into that in specific detail. And I think that is a good stopping point for this video. So I'm going to stop there so you can go back and look at some of this as you go through gizmos, as we talk more in class. So there you go. See you soon.